So time for some new rules for the greater good. Let's talk about what the auxiliary cadre can do in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tau, and in this video we're going over the auxiliary cadre, the new rules for them. I feel like it's at least a fairly interesting detachment that could get some good time on the tabletop. As ever, this is part of Games Workshop's Grotmas Advent Calendar, 40k rules content literally every day, with a new detachment for every faction in the game. Like the rest, this one will be fully playable in the core match play rules, has all the points for enhancements included in it, and it'll be available on the app in January. We've not really got all that many more to go. I believe it's Black Templars, World Eaters and Space Wolves. Tomorrow's the Black Templars, so I guess we'll see what we have in store for some Righteous Crusaders. As I think a lot of people were expecting, the Tau detachment has turned out to be a combined arms auxiliary one. In the Tau Codex there's 3 ones that support the Tau in various different ways, one that helps out the crews only, but they didn't really have one that actually helps out both forces fighting together, and we have seen really quite a lot of those in 40k, some in codexes like the Custodian's Talons of the Emperor style one, and really quite a few of these Grotmas detachments. It did seem like it was one of the more obvious themes that was missing with a sort of Delith Sept detachment, as they've had in the past, and it's something that actually gives the Vespid a bit of support, even if I'm not sure they're going to be the most focal unit in this one. I guess perhaps one of the alternatives could have been more something like a big tank force with Hammerhead, Skyrays and Devilfish, though I feel like they do those kind of okay with Montcar and Kauyon. That still could have been another good alternative though if they'd wanted. Jumping into the rules, and it's basically one of these 2-part allied detachment style rules where both the Tau and allies can help each other out in one way or another. Basically the auxiliary units in the Crute and the Vespid boost other Tau shooting. If Tau units that aren't those types shoot at something within 9 inches of one of those auxiliary units and is also visible to that auxiliary unit, the Tau unit gets an extra AP -1, and that does add to the whole stack of buffs that Tau can put on their shooting, plus 1 ballistic skill from being guided, potentially with ignores cover, and adding in stealth suit rerolls as well. To me, it doesn't really feel quite as devastating as either Montcar or Kauyon with the big damage boost that they get, but against the right targets, particularly high armor save ones, it'll be pretty savage, and you can get it all game long, but you do need to trigger it with cheaper expendable units getting close to the enemy. It feels like Crute Hounds could be a really good choice for that, or maybe even individual Crute Ox Riders running around, just small cheap units that don't matter too much if you happen to lose them. The second half of the buff is a slightly weirder one. As you'd expect, this one's the Tau supporting their auxiliaries, and this one's called Localized Stealth Projectors. When a friendly Crute or Vespid unit is wholly within 6 inches of a Tau unit and they're also visible to them, the Crute or Vespid can't be shot at greater than 18-inch range, so it could protect them from some long-range heavy weapon fire. That's usually quite a powerful rule, and it's fairly disruptive. I feel like besides just being a bit annoying for the opponent though, it doesn't really feel quite as meaningful as the first bit. It seems like the first bit wants them to advance right into the face of the enemy and get dead close, in which case they might well be within that 18-inch range or in charge range. I feel like there's not quite as much value in having Crute units hang back. It's not like they have crazy firepower. Though I guess maybe it could be annoying for objective things. You could have a Tau unit out of line of sight, or being a ghost kill or shadow sun or something, and then the Crute unit could be within 6 inches and just curve round terrain to be in line of sight of that unit. Potentially they could be on an objective and also triggering that rule, which I guess could be somewhat helpful. Perhaps the biggest deal feels like it could just protect rampagers from the Alpha Strike maybe, and they might still be able to trigger that while scouting forward a little. Overall, I'd say the AP boost is the bigger bit though. Seems at least fairly strong as these allied style rules go, though given it's competing with really quite big damage boosts like Montcar and Kauyon, it definitely has some stiff competition, and if you had one of either your Tau or Crute units shot down, then everything is going to fall apart a bit. Moving into Stratagems, and the first 2 are some really quite serious boosts for the auxiliaries in terms of damage. The first one is 1 command point for Crute or Vespid gaining an extra AP -1 when they're shooting or fighting. My first thought with that one is definitely the Rampagers. They can stack a pretty enormous amount of wounds on the enemy, but the main downside is that they're all AP -1. This one feels very, very relevant for them on taking down anything that's got a high save, and I guess it could in theory be okay on a bunch of the other auxiliary type units. Vespid Neutron Blasters at AP3. Crute Carnivore Volume Fire or Melee getting a small boost, or I guess Crute Ox Rider range or melee. I feel like in general those are the sort of units though that you wouldn't be as tempted to buff. The Rampagers feel like the ones that are actual mainline damage dealers. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Multisensory Scanning. This one allows any Tau units to reroll wound rolls of 1 in the shooting or fight phase, which isn't really the biggest deal in the world, particularly as you can pick that up from the spotting stealth suits really easily. But again on Crute and Vespid it gets far better, and it gets boosted up to reroll all wound rolls. Again, like the first one, the most obvious place again feels like it's the Rampagers. Again, loads of volume attacks, but at slightly low strength at strength 6, and again this is going to convert to a massive amount more wounds. if you really wanted them to hit spectacularly hard. You certainly could use both of them if you wanted, maybe combo with a lone spear to help out with the hit rolls, get a pretty ridiculous amount of damage to and lance hits, and then get extra AP and re-roll the wound roll. It feels like your opponent would have to respect the rampagers, as they could probably tear apart the vast majority of units in the game. They should be able to down knights with all that going on. Again, could be okay situationally for the other ones, though I feel like most of the time people probably still won't be building around Vespid or Carnivores as damage dealers, but if you did happen to have a big unit of one or the other for any reason, this one's certainly a good damage boost. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Pheromone Waypoints. This one gives you an automatic 6-inch advance for Kroot or Vespid. That one feels like a bit of a situational one really, as most of the units wouldn't be able to deal damage after going that far. Feels like the biggest impact is if you needed a high advance roll to get onto an objective, which could be a really massive deal, then perhaps it could be worth just dialing that in advance to make sure that you get there. I guess you could have on the board Vespid moving really quite quickly, move 18 inches and still shoot with their neutron blasters, which get the assault keyword. And if you're feeling spendy, then you could go for it on the rampagers and combine it with the advance and charge one just below for a pretty crazy threat range, but I guess you'd have to weigh that up versus not having the damage stratagems, as you're not going to be able to spend maximally on movement and damage for the rampagers. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Alien Expertise. This allows advance and shoot for any Tau unit, which is just kind of handy to have. Quite nice for slow moving things like broadsides, or could be useful for the tanks if that extra d6 inches is going to give you the chance to get a line of sight or get onto an objective and still being able to shoot. And then for Kroot and Vespid, that's boosted to advance, shoot and charge. Again, as with the previous 3, I feel like there's a good chance that's going to be best on the rampagers, where they can scout a bit, but then they move kind of slowly at 7-inch movement. Being able to advance and charge could definitely up the amount of units that they could catch. And as mentioned, you could combine it with the 6-inch auto advance, so that means they'd be moving 13 inches and then able to charge after that, so a 20-inch threat range. Combined with a scout move, that should allow them to be pretty threatening. But that would be a big 2 command points, so you wouldn't be able to use it on your first turn unless you got lucky with an ethereal or something. I feel like all 4 of the first 4 stratagems could be pretty good with the Krootots rampagers, various amounts of extra movement and extra damage, but you certainly can't have them all, as otherwise you'll be spending loads of CP. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Interlocking Manoeuvres, and you use this one at the end of the fight phase, either a normal move of 6 inches or fall back at the end of the fight phase, and that one does feel like a pretty powerful one just for Tau in general. It's not locked to the auxiliaries this time. The normal move would happen usually if you've destroyed the enemy unit in close combat, which most Tau won't be doing, again bar the rampagers once more. I guess that could be handy to take some cover or just move towards an objective. The fallback feels like the most powerful one though. You could use it at the end of your opponent's fight phase, and then basically if they've just charged one of your units and damaged it, you could essentially just use this to fall back. Then the unit wouldn't be in combat and it's just free to do absolutely what it wants. So to be able to move normally in the movement phase for some really quite good movement, then shoot something, maybe even declare a charge if it wants to. And that's just a really good stratagem for supporting Tau units in general. Again, if we're going to hyperfixate on the rampagers, that the rest of the stratagems seem to be encouraging. That could be a way just to have them fall back, shoot something with the lances and then charge something else and get those mortal wound impact hits again. I guess the only downside with the timing is that you'd have to preserve the command point until the end of the enemy turn, so you'd have to not spend it on Overwatch or something. This one definitely seems good support for Tau in general though. Pretty useful for anything besides Riptides, which can already fall back and shoot. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Guided Fire. This one's really quite an interesting one, and it gives you +1 strength to your Tau non-auxiliary units shooting, being boosted up to a +2 strength if your unit's wholly within 9 inches of a Kroot or Vespid unit. It's kind of interesting that this buff's dependent on the Kroot or Vespid being close to you and not close to the enemy, unlike the detachment rule. But I guess if you're trying to make use of those stealth generators and stop them getting shot, they might be close to you in any case. This one's a pretty powerful one just to be able to see what it can apply to in a shooting phase. If that winds up translating to a +1 to wound, I think it's often going to be worth it, particularly with the extra AP that you could be getting from this one. And for the right weapon, some of the time it could be a big +2 to wound. Say for example, if you're firing fusion blasters at a strength 10 vehicle, that would go from strength 9 to strength 11. And for other targets of this, you could be getting things like strength 9 AP2 missile pods, strength 10 ion accelerators or ion cannons with boosted AP, or for a close range crisis suit drop, you could have strength 6 and AP2 flamers in your own shooting phase, which just seems utterly murderous for Starscythe suits when firing against infantry. I guess strength 7 AP2 burst cannons would also be a possibility. Feels like you'd be ruining the day of everything up to Terminator equivalent with those on the go. Overall, feels like the stratagems are broadly quite powerful. I think the fall back one, the advance and shoot one, and the boosted strength for shooting ones are all really nice support for the Tau army. Though otherwise it really does feel like the stratagems are trying to encourage you to take rampagers to tear the enemy apart in melee, both with the option just to hit extra savagely in close combat and get a lot more speed if you need it. Finally, we've got the enhancements. First up, there's Student of Kauyon for 15 points. This one allows you to deep strike 3 Kroot carnivores or Farstalker units. I feel like in a lot of other armies that would be quite a helpful thing to have some deep striking chaff, but Tau don't really do too bad for it. You could have Vespid if you wanted cheap units to deep strike that also work okay with the detachment, and you might have lots of crisis suits dropping in if you want them. I feel like if it was close enough to trigger the detachment rule, say if that was at 10 inches rather than 9, it might be a different story to be able to deploy that reliably, but otherwise just doesn't really seem super strong. Next up, for 20 points, we've got Admired Leader. This one's for a non-Kroot model, and it allows them to hand out a +1 leadership and +1 OC to a Kroot unit in the command phase within 12 inches. It seems like the best use of that would be to put it on a fast-moving unit like Hounds or maybe some outlying carnivores, and then rush them towards the enemy and within that 9-inch range, hopefully tipping an objective in the process and making it yours for a bit, and also being able to provide the AP debuff for the Tau unit shooting the enemies nearby. I'm not sure whether it's actually worth the extra 20 points though. I feel like a lot of the Kroot units have some okay objective control anyway, and the Hounds can still get it with a cheap Kroot character around. I feel like compared with some objective control shenanigans though, it doesn't seem too awful on paper. Next up, for 10 points, there's Fanatical Convert. This one gives a Kroot unit for the greater good, so it means that you could have them spot for other Tau things, or get guided themselves, which I guess would have your carnivores hitting on a 3+. It feels a little bit non-ideal, but for 10 points doesn't seem awful. Maybe you could have a lone spear spotter, and he could use for the greater good to support another unit, while he's also using his main buff via a sniper rifle, and handing out reroll hit rolls for a Krootox Rampager charge. Feels like he could be an okay support piece there, and could also be a model to help provide that +2 strength buff to a Tau unit that wants it. Feels like there's enough there to make that good on paper. Between that and normal lone operative annoyance things, it's still not going to be quite as good compared with, say, a Marker-like unit of stealth suits, which will give you ignores cover and reroll ones to hit and wound as well though. Finally, for 25 points, there's the Transponder Lock Nodule. This one gives a battlesuit unit first turn deep strike if it can set up within 12 inches of an auxiliary unit. To me, this one sounds like a pretty nice Alpha Strike style option. Feels like you could have a lot of good drop zones on the go with some fast moving Kroot Hounds or maybe some Kroot Rampagers pushing up early. We're also using Farstalkers that can start in the midfield to start with. Feels like some star-sized suits with the Flamers and boost them up to Strength 6 AP2 if you needed should absolutely murderize some screens. And that feels like quite a nice option to be able to drop in turn 1 if you want to, or even potentially have some Forge suits to be able to try and do the same if the opponent doesn't have enough screening units to stop their heavy hitters from getting shot by fusion blasters, potentially at strength 11. That one does seem quite fun on paper, maybe one of the stronger things. Overall, I feel like this is one of the ones that does its job well enough. A detachment rule that seems at least fairly solidly helpful to both sides, even if it's more the auxiliaries supporting the Tau units, though I think that's probably the way around that you'd want it, given that they're most of the main damage dealers anyway. There are a bunch of stratagems that can help support the Tau: fall back and shoot, advance and shoot, and the strength buff for ranged attacks, or help out. And then there's lots of things that can help the auxiliaries punch up, particularly those Rampagers. I feel like the first turn deep strike is an interesting enough one as well. Seems handy enough to be able to use that to burn away outlying units with star-sized suits. In general, it feels like it does the job to encourage a mixed army of Tau and auxiliaries, though it'll only be relevant for Tau players that actually have gone into the Tau plus Kroot thing. It certainly seems to be Games Workshop's thing to sell with this last codex, given that they had the whole new Kroot range come out. It does feel like you want a good number of Hounds, Rampagers, and probably some Carnivores for sticky objectives to make this one work though. I think at first impressions it feels kind of okay. Probably the main issue is passing up the massive easy damage boost from Montcar and Kauyon that you'd be giving up. I feel like the Retaliation Cadre might be a little bit less popular given the 6-inch deep strike nerf. I think for first impressions I'd probably be most tempted by 3 units of Kroot Hounds to hand out that AP-1 for nice and cheap. Probably at least a couple of blocks of Rampagers, maybe one to have hurtling in fairly early in the game, and want to have a bit more of a countercharge threat and maybe move up a bit more cagely. I think I'd want one crisis block at least with the first turn deep strike to be able to threaten. Maybe having some Star Scythe and Sunforge wouldn't be the worst, so you could choose which one you use it on. And then maybe have some Kroot units loitering around the home field as well. Maybe some individual riders or perhaps some carnivore squads to sticky objectives and things. And back up some big scary guns, like maybe ion cannons perhaps, which would get on pretty well with a chance to get up to strength 10 and AP3 when they need to. Overall seems interesting enough. At first impressions it doesn't really feel like the new meta Tau detachment, but I think there's enough strong stuff here to make it work if you really want to, and I'm sure some people will. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the detachment. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics or check out the full Grotmus detachment playlist linked down in the video description. It looks like I'll be back tomorrow for some Black Templars. It should be fun to see what their second unique detachment is. If you'd like to support the channel and keep all the videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.